we're going to put some of your points to my next guest now. Let's take you live to New York. We're going to speak to Belle Etra Yoeli, who's Chief Advocacy Officer at American Jewish Committee. Belle, thank you too for being with us on the programme. We'll come on to some of those issues in just a moment, but I want to start with that court ruling because I've seen it described today by some people in Israel as a good balance, one that allows Israel to continue to defend itself, but one that also protects the lives of civilians. Do you agree with that assessment?
Listen, I think, first of all, thank you for having me. It has to be said first and foremost, before I even comment on today's ruling, that the fact that we're even discussing this case of accusation of genocide against Israel, the entire premise is false and deeply offensive. So that has to be said first and foremost, and I know we'll come back to some of the accusations and claims of the previous guests. But most importantly, the ruling of provisional measures that were issued today asks Israel to do things that it has already been doing every single day in Gaza in accordance with Israeli law and international law. And most importantly, the court did not ask Israel to cease its military operations in Gaza, and that is very significant. Israel does more than any other country in the world to prevent civilian deaths. And yes, this is a war, and people die in war. Israelis and Palestinians have died in this war, and that is tragic. But this entire basis of this case is based on the idea that there is intent here to kill civilians, and that's not true. Now, that is not what this ruling was about. And in these provisional measures, what Israel is being asked to do is nothing that it is not already doing every single day in conducting its war of self-defense against Hamas. It does everything possible to prevent civilian harm.
What this case does highlight, and the issue at hand here, is how Israel has carried out this war. Significant questions remain about the targeting of locations within Gaza, the deaths of civilians, the mass movement of people across the territory, the lack of access to medical supplies, the lack of access to food. Is it your assessment that Israel has done enough to protect the lives of those civilians?
I think Israel is doing everything it possibly can to protect the lives of civilians, and they have shown a continued commitment, including the representatives who spoke in the court, to do everything it can to provide humanitarian aid, which is why I was surprised by the previous guests' claim that there isn't already undue pressure on Israel to do just that. And that pressure doesn't just come from the international community. Israel holds itself to the highest standard when it comes to doing everything that can. Dozens of trucks, thousands of trucks entering aid every single day. Now, we have to acknowledge what's not being said here, which is that Israel operates in an extremely difficult, if not one of the most extremely difficult environments in this war, because Hamas embeds itself in the civilian population. And of course, Hamas has also restricted and made it more difficult for civilians to get access to aid. So this black and white picture is a constant misrepresentation of the truth. This is an extremely difficult circumstance of war, which Israel did not seek. And in trying to both eliminate the threat posed by Hamas in Gaza and save the hostages who remain in Gaza and bring them back home, yes, Israel is continuing to administer humanitarian aid to the best of its ability. Is that a simple process? No. Will that continue? Yes.
But once again, we get reports, constant reports of areas that were deemed to be safe, places that people would reasonably expect to be safe, like medical facilities and hospitals, once again targeted by Israeli airstrikes. I'm thinking here particularly in the south of Gaza. And I'll put it to you again, it's a familiar refrain, but it's about proportionality. Once again, looking at the numbers here, that in those attacks on October the 7th, Israel lost 1,300 people, 240 hostages. The fate of many still are unknown. But now we know that Israeli attacks have killed more than 25,900 people in Gaza, nearly 26,000. Is that a proportionate response to what happened in Israel on October the 7th?
Look, I know that it's very easy to make the direct jump to proportionality and play the numbers game.
But it is an important point.
No, and I'm not dismissing it, but I think we have to be clear. First of all, the numbers that you're citing include militants. And what's often left out of this story and the reporting on this is that really important fact. No one is going to sit, anyone in good conscience, Israeli or otherwise, is going to sit here and say of trying to justify numbers of civilian casualties. What we will say, and what is forgotten in this conversation, is that this is war. And yes, the death of civilians is tragic, but Israel has to and has a responsibility to its civilians, to its citizens, to prevent further attacks, which Hamas has continued after October 7th. Its leaders have continued to claim they will perpetuate again and again, because, of course, at the highest level of hypocrisy, what's left out of this story is that the genocidal player here, by the way, which the court has no jurisdiction over, is in fact Hamas. They have genocidal intent to kill the Jewish people.
But of the near
in
26,000 people who have been killed by Israeli airstrikes, most of them are women and children, and most of them have been involved in airstrikes near to facilities that were deemed to be safe.
I'd be very interested to see this simple discussion of numbers of people who have been killed. Again, we're talking about terrorists in a war zone, and the numbers that you're citing are coming out of the Gaza controlled by Hamas. I mean, this is not, again, this black and white picture, it's not as simple, but I want to go back to my original point, which is this is a war and civilians die in war. And yes, the numbers, even if we don't have to, in putting aside the dispute, because we actually don't know the final current number, this is a terrible, terrible tragedy. And Israel does not want this. And if you've seen it, and of course there have been senior U.S. military officials and others who comment on this on the news every single day, the process, the lengths that Israel goes to in every single strike with legal authorities present to determine what should happen is unparalleled in the history of warfare. Are civilians dying? Yes, that is tragic. But this is war. This is war. And again, this war could end today if Hamas put down its arms and returned the hostages. So this constant circling back to as if warfare has never happened in the history of the world. And it's of course painful and we're not used to it in modern times, but Israel is doing what it has to do to eliminate Hamas, a terror organization who cares less about the Palestinian people living in Gaza than Israel does.
Belle, it's good to have you on the programme with us tonight. Thank you. That's Belle Etra Yoeli, Chief Advocacy Officer at American Jewish Committee.